Before this story begins, pause for just a moment. Not long, just a single second. Because if you're someone who enjoys slow, emotional stories, the kind that feel uncomfortably real, the kind that don't depend on shocking twists or dramatic explosions, the kind that quietly settle into your mind and stay there long after the screen goes dark, then you might want to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Stories like the one you're about to hear aren't just something you watch. They linger. They follow you into quiet moments later in the day. Sometimes they make you question the choices you've made, the paths you've taken, or the silences you've accepted in your own life. And tonight's story is exactly that kind. It's a story about quiet things, about the kind of decisions that don't feel dangerous when they begin, about the slow shifts, an emotion that happens so gradually you barely notice them until one day you realize something inside you has already changed. No dramatic betrayal, no shouting, no sudden collapse, just the quiet unraveling of something that once felt permanent. And strangely enough, it all began with a message that didn't actually say anything. When everything started to fall apart, Emily Carter wasn't in the middle of a crisis. There was no argument. She wasn't even particularly upset. She was simply sitting in her car. Traffic along Interstate 5 moved with a frustrating kind of patience. Slow enough to test your nerves, but never quite slow enough to fully stop. Rows of cars stretched endlessly in front of her, their red brake lights glowing softly through the thin curtain of rain. From a distance, it looked almost peaceful. Up close, it felt exhausting. Emily's foot rested lightly on the brake pedal. Her hands loosely held the steering wheel. She stared ahead at a traffic light that had been red long enough to feel personal, as if it had chosen her specifically to inconvenience. Rain had only recently started falling. Not the heavy kind that drums loudly against the roof. Just a quiet drizzle, the kind that slowly changes the mood of everything without announcing itself. The windshield wipers moved in their steady rhythm. Left, right, left again. A hypnotic motion that almost felt calming. Almost. Emily exhaled softly and leaned back in her seat. It had been a long day at work, not unusually stressful. Not particularly memorable either. Just the kind of day that blurred into every other weekday. Meetings, emails, deadlines, schedules carefully arranged into neat blocks of time. Predictable, organized, safe, and yet something about the evening felt heavier than usual, though she couldn't quite explain why. Then her phone vibrated. It wasn't loud, just a soft buzz against the passenger seat. Emily glanced at it automatically, the same way people do hundreds of times a day without thinking. One notification, just one. The screen lit up briefly. There was no emoji, no greeting, no explanation, just two. Words, her name, Emily, that was it. For reasons she couldn't explain in that moment, something inside her chest tightened. Her heartbeat stumbled slightly, not enough to scare her, but enough that she noticed it. Her breathing shifted, just for a second, a little faster, a little shallower. Nothing bad had happened. There was no accusation waiting behind the message, no emergency, noises, just a name. Her name still inside her changed, not outside, inside. The kind of shift that is almost invisible in the moment. The kind you only recognize much later when you look back and realize that was the first crack. The traffic light turned green. Cars around her began to move forward. But Emily didn't, not immediately. She stayed still for half a second too long, staring at the phone as if it might somehow explain itself. It didn't. The driver behind her tapped their horn impatiently. Emily blinked, shook herself out of the moment, and slowly pressed the accelerator. Traffic moved forward again, but the quiet feeling in her chest didn't disappear. Emily Carter lived in a quiet suburb just outside Seattle. It was the kind of neighborhood that felt almost designed for stability. Lawns were trimmed neatly. Mailboxes stood in orderly rows. Porch lights switched on around the same time every evening as the sun faded behind the trees. Neighbors waved politely when they passed each other. Friendly, respectful, but rarely lingering long enough to have real conversations. It was comfortable, predictable, safe. Emily had lived there for 4 years with her husband, Daniel Carter. They had been married for nine years, long enough for life together to feel permanent, long enough that people stopped asking newlywed questions they had met in college. Back then, everything felt simple. They studied together in quiet library corners, shared cheap late-night meals during exam weeks, talked endlessly about the future the way young couples often do with certainty that love alone could solve anything. They believed in each other, in the life they would build, and for a long time it worked. After graduation, they did everything the responsible way. Daniel found a steady job in software development. Emily began working in project coordination. They rented a small apartment, saved carefully, budgeted responsibly. Eventually, they bought their modest house in the suburbs. It had a small backyard, a front porch with 2 wooden chairs. They once promised each other they would sit there every evening during summer. They rarely did, but the idea of it had felt meaningful. For many years, Emily believed this was what success looked like: stability, security, routine. Daniel wasn't a bad husband. That was the hardest part. He was dependable, quietly kind, the type of man who remembered anniversaries without needing reminders, the type who fixed broken shelves without complaining, who asked how her day had been and genuinely listened to the answer. There were no betrayals, no fights that shook the house, no obvious reason for unhappiness. And yet, somewhere over the years, something faded. Not suddenly, not dramatically, it simply softened. Their conversations slowly lost color. They talked about groceries, about bills, about work schedules, about weekend plans that repeated themselves. So often they stopped feeling like choices: dinner, television, sleep, repeat. They still slept in the same bed every night, close enough that their shoulders sometimes touched, and yet Emily often felt a quiet loneliness. She couldn't explain. She told herself this was normal. Everyone settles eventually. Everyone trades excitement for stability. That's what adulthood is supposed to look like, right? At least that's what she kept telling herself until the day Michael Reynolds walked into the architecture firm where she worked, and without trying to change everything,